You want to know how Islam and Christianity came to Africa, right? Especially how Christianity came to West Africa. Now listen carefully. Let's start with the Arab Muslims. The Muslim-Arab slave trade have already started in Africa over 700 years before the European transatlantic slave trade. This slave trade started when the Arabs first invaded North Africa in the 7th century AD. The Arab first entry point into Africa was through Egypt. An Arab military general named General Amin Abin Alas invaded Egypt in December 639 AD with the capacity of 4,000 soldiers. General Amin successfully conquered Egypt and went ahead and conquered other places such as Tunisia and Western Libya. African slaves were used as sexual objects and domestic house help to Arab traders. Sometimes, whenever any African slave is sick, its owner will quickly put a bullet in their head. It has been estimated that from the 10th to the 19th century, 6,000 to 7,000 slaves were transported each year, and each time African slaves under Arab slave traders crossed the desert, hundreds of African slaves died even before they get water to drink. The Arab slave trade was absolutely brutal and devastating to African people. Through this Islamic slave trade in Africa, Africans in North Africa were Islamized by their Arab slave masters. And today many Africans parade themselves as Muslims without knowing how the owners of such religion brutally enslaved their black African ancestors for over 700 years. As of the transatlantic slave trade, which is also called the European Christian slave trade, which transported Christianity into Africa. Now listen, historically speaking, it is said that Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal came up with the idea of the transatlantic slave trade in Europe. He made Portugal the first European country to engage in the slave trade from the mid-15th century, precisely in the 1450s. Africans were taken against their will and forced onto slave ships. The African slaves were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean. The fact is that slavery was supported and made legal by the European government, popes, and the monarchy. Captain John Hawkins was the first Englishman who made the first slave trade voyage to Africa from the year 1555 to 1562 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. He was given a ship named Jesus of Lubeck by the Queen. He was called the first transatlantic slave trader because he was the man who formed a triangular route across the ocean. In order to understand what the triangular or transatlantic slave trade means, one needs to understand that it was 3 continents that were involved, which were Europe, Africa, and America. For instance, the European slave traders will leave the European seaports and journey to the West African coast. There they will capture and forcefully take Africans as slaves into their slave ship and journey to America. The fact is that Africans were reduced to the lowest animals ever and subjected to brutal savagery and complete barbarism. African ancestors died and brutality was unleashed on them in the slave ship. History recorded that over 10 million Africans were drowned to death by the European slave masters during the transatlantic slave trade. The European reptilian, vulturish, and vampire eyes sucked the very lifeblood of African people. African little black infant babies were snatched from their mothers and sexually molested and viciously raped in front of their helpless parents by European homosexuals and pedophiles. African fathers, brothers, daughters, mothers, and uncles were sodomized into barbaric sexuality. African boys and girls were forced by the white men to have sexual intercourse so that they can have babies and have slave children for the European slave masters. This was a vicious humiliation of generations of African people under white supremacy for over 400 years. Our mothers and sisters were sexually abused every day in the slave ship by European sex addicts, and they were inflicted with a lot of pains and barbarism. The religion of the European slave masters, which is Christianity, condoned all this evil. That was why the Christian missionaries could not speak when their white Europeans were taking Africans as slaves. Rather, they were busy using their Bible to brainwash Africans to be silent and blindly accept every maltreatment unleashed on them by the white man. our ancestors were killed and mothers brutalized in the name of their white Jesus. According to Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and Desmond Tutu of South Africa, when they said we should close our eyes to pray, after praying, we opened our eyes, we found Bible in our hands, and they seized and conquered our lands in the name of their white Jesus, just as they raped our mothers in the name of their white Jesus, and their science justified it completely. We were caged and butchered like animals to be used for their fake science and experimentation in Europe and America. This is a history, our history lecturer in the university, all our lecturers in the university who are into history, this is the history they will not teach you when it comes to slave trade.